The morning briefing room at Fort Braxton fell silent as Colonel Marcus Garrett looked up from his files, his weathered face showing barely concealed disbelief. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that they've assigned a 28-year-old captain to lead our most critical counterterrorism operation?" His eyes locked onto the young woman sitting across from him, Captain Allyson Jones, whose calm demeanor seemed to irritate him even more. "No offense, Captain, but this mission requires someone with real experience, someone who's been tested in actual combat situations." What Colonel Garrett didn't know was that he was staring at one of the most decorated special operations veterans in the entire U.S. military, a fact that was about to change everything he thought he knew about leadership, experience, and the price of making assumptions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Allyson Jones stepped off the military transport at Fort Braxton as the Georgia sun beat down mercilessly on the tarmac. The base sprawled before her like a small city, all concrete buildings and ordered chaos, with the distant sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the humid air. She adjusted her duffel bag and walked toward the main administrative building, her boots clicking against the hot asphalt with the measured cadence of someone who'd learned to project confidence even when walking into the unknown. Fort Braxton was different from her previous assignments. This wasn't a forward operating base in some distant conflict zone or a training facility where everyone knew the rules. This was a major domestic installation, home to the 82nd Airborne Division and the Army's premier Special Operations Command. It was also, according to the briefing packet she'd studied during the flight, a place where tradition mattered more than innovation, and where newcomers were viewed with suspicion until they proved themselves worthy of inclusion. The assignment itself was unusual. Captain Jones had been handpicked by Pentagon officials to lead a joint task force focused on domestic counterterrorism operations, a new initiative that combined military special operations with federal law enforcement agencies. It was the kind of high-profile, politically sensitive mission that could make or break a career, depending on how it played out. The fact that she'd been chosen over dozens of more senior officers was already causing ripples throughout the command structure. Inside the air-conditioned sanctuary of the administrative building, Allyson presented her orders to a bored-looking sergeant who barely glanced at her credentials before pointing toward an elevator bank. "Third floor, Colonel Garrett's office. He's expecting you." The sergeant's tone suggested that whatever the colonel was expecting, it probably wasn't good news for anyone involved. The elevator ride gave Allyson a moment to center herself. She'd been through enough difficult assignments to know that first impressions often determined whether a mission would succeed or fail before it even began. Her reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman who looked younger than her 28 years, with auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun and green eyes that held more experience than most people accumulated in a lifetime. The ribbons on her uniform told part of her story: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Action Badge, but they didn't tell the whole story. They couldn't convey the weight of decisions made in split seconds under impossible circumstances, or the price of carrying. "Captain Jones," he said without looking up immediately, "have a seat." The chairs in front of his desk were positioned slightly lower than his own, a subtle psychological tactic that Allyson recognized but chose not to acknowledge. She sat down and waited, using the silence to observe details about the man who would determine the success or failure of her mission. His uniform was immaculate, his awards impressive but not overwhelming, and his demeanor suggested someone who was accustomed to being the smartest person in any room he entered. When Colonel Garrett finally looked up from her file, his expression was carefully neutral. "I've been reviewing your record, Captain. Impressive academic credentials. West Point, top 10% of your class, advanced degrees in international relations and counterterrorism studies. Your performance evaluations are consistently excellent, and you seem to have a talent for languages." He paused, setting down his glasses. "What I don't see is the kind of extensive field experience that typically qualifies someone for a mission of this magnitude." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Allyson had expected this conversation. It was the same skepticism she'd encountered at every new assignment for the past 6 years. Her actual experience was largely classified, buried in files that required clearances most officers would never possess. To anyone reviewing her standard personnel record, she looked like a bright, capable officer who'd spent most of her career in desk jobs and training assignments. "Sir," she replied evenly, "I understand your concerns. I'm prepared to earn your confidence through performance rather than credentials. It was a diplomatic response that acknowledged his position without revealing information she wasn't authorized to share. Colonel Garrett leaned back in his chair, studying her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Captain, let me be direct. This task force is being created in response to intelligence suggesting that domestic terrorist cells are planning coordinated attacks on military installations. The mission requires someone who can think like a terrorist, anticipate their tactics, and coordinate with multiple agencies that don't always play well together. It's not the kind of assignment where we can afford on-the-job training. I understand the stakes, sir. I wouldn't have accepted the assignment if I didn't believe I was qualified to handle it. Allison's voice remained steady, but she could feel the familiar tension that came with walking the line between confidence and insubordination. That's admirable, Captain, but belief and capability aren't the same thing. Garrett stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. I've spent 32 years in the Army. I've led men in combat in Iraq, Afghanistan, and half a dozen other places that don't officially exist. I've seen what happens when inexperienced officers are given responsibilities they can't handle, and I've attended too many funerals that could have been prevented with better judgment. The implication was clear. He considered her a liability, a political appointment who would endanger lives through inexperience. It was a judgment that stung precisely because it was so far from the truth. Allyson had seen more combat than most of the colonels on the base, had made life-and-death decisions that saved civilian lives and prevented international incidents. But those experiences existed in a classified world that she couldn't reference without authorization. Sir, I respect your experience and your concerns. I'm hoping that over time, you'll give me the opportunity to demonstrate my capabilities. She kept her tone professional, even as she felt the familiar frustration of being underestimated by people who saw only what they were allowed to see. Colonel Garrett turned back to face her, his expression softening slightly. Captain, I want to be clear about something. This isn't personal. You seem like a dedicated officer, and I'm sure you've worked hard to get where you are. But dedication and hard work aren't enough for what we're facing. These terrorists aren't playing games. They're sophisticated, well-funded, and absolutely ruthless. They've been planning their operations for months, possibly years. Going up against them. I understand, sir. Allyson stood up, recognizing that the meeting was coming to an end. When do you need me to begin briefing with the task force? Tomorrow, 0800 hours, Conference Room B in the Intelligence Building. Garrett walked back to his desk and picked up another file. Captain, I hope I'm wrong about this. I hope you prove me wrong. But until that happens, I'll be watching every decision you make very carefully. As Allyson left the colonel's office, she felt the weight of expectations and skepticism settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden. It wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated, and it probably wouldn't be the last. The challenge was finding a way to succeed without revealing the classified experiences that would instantly change how people viewed her capabilities. Walking across the base toward her assigned quarters, she passed groups of soldiers engaged in various training exercises. Some glanced at her with curiosity. New faces always attracted attention on military installations. Others seemed to look through her entirely, as if she were just another administrative officer who would disappear into the bureaucracy without making any real impact. What none of them knew was that Captain Allyson Jones had spent the last 6 years operating in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, often under assumed identities, and with backup that was hours or days away. She'd learned to speak 5 languages fluently, could blend into civilian populations in a dozen different countries, and had developed an instinctive understanding of how terrorist organizations operated from the inside. Her personnel file might look thin on combat experience, but the classified files told a different story entirely. The quarters assigned to her were typical military efficiency, small, functional, and utterly impersonal. As she unpacked her belongings, Allyson allowed herself a moment to consider the irony of her situation. Tomorrow, she would begin leading a task force designed to prevent the exact kind of attacks she'd spent years helping to stop in other parts of the world. The difference was that this time she'd be working with people who saw her as an inexperienced officer rather than the seasoned operative she'd become. Her satellite phone buzzed with an encrypted message from her handler at the Pentagon. Status report requested. Any initial challenges with local command? She typed back a brief response. Standard skepticism. Nothing unexpected. We'll proceed as planned." The exchange reminded her that while Colonel Garrett might doubt her experience, there were people in Washington who knew exactly what she was capable of accomplishing. As night fell over Fort Braxton, Allyson stood at her window looking out over the base that would be her home for the foreseeable future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her ability to lead, without revealing the full extent of her qualifications. It was a balancing act she'd performed many times before, but never with quite so much at stake. The mission ahead would require her to earn the trust and respect of people who had every reason to doubt her, while simultaneously preventing attacks that could cost hundreds of lives. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation that had defined her career, and exactly the kind of challenge she'd learned to embrace rather than fear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The intelligence building at Fort Braxton hummed with activity at 0730 hours. As Captain Allyson Jones made her way to Conference Room B, the hallways were filled with personnel carrying classified folders and speaking in hushed tones, the kind of controlled urgency that indicated something significant was developing. Allyson had arrived early to review the files she'd been given access to, and what she'd read had confirmed her worst suspicions about the threat they were facing. Conference Room B was larger than she'd expected, with a massive table that could accommodate 20 people and walls lined with secure communication equipment. When she entered, she found herself facing a diverse group of individuals who represented the various agencies that would comprise her task force. The tension in the room was immediately apparent. These were people from different organizations with different priorities, and they were clearly skeptical about being placed under the command of someone they'd never heard of. At the head of the table sat Major Rebecca Davis, a Special Forces officer with a reputation for aggressive tactics and an obvious frustration with bureaucratic oversight. Her buzz-cut hair and scarred hands told the story of someone who'd spent serious time in combat zones, and her expression suggested she wasn't impressed with her new commander. To her right sat Agent Sarah Mitchell from the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Unit, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, whose credentials included investigating some of the most high-profile terrorist cases of the past decade. Across from them, Agent Kevin Rodriguez from the Department of Homeland Security was reviewing what appeared to be surveillance photographs, his face grim as he studied the images. Next to him sat Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison from Military Intelligence, whose pristine uniform and careful demeanor marked him as someone who preferred analyses to action. The final member of the core team was Master Sergeant Lisa Thompson, a communications specialist whose equipment expertise would be crucial for coordinating with multiple agencies. "Good morning," Allyson said as she took her position at the head of the table. "I know most of you have questions about this task force and about my qualifications to lead it. I'm hoping that by the end of this briefing you'll have a better understanding of what we're facing and why immediate action is necessary." Major Davis leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "Captain, with respect, most of us have been dealing with domestic threats for years. What makes this situation different enough to require a new command structure?" It was a fair question, and Allyson had expected it. "Major, the intelligence we've received suggests that we're not dealing with traditional domestic terrorist cells. These groups have international connections, sophisticated funding, and operational capabilities that exceed anything we've seen before on American soil." She activated the room's display system and pulled up a series of intercepted communications that had been declassified for this briefing. 3 weeks ago, NSA intercepted these encrypted messages between known terrorist operatives in Syria and individuals operating within the United States. The conversations reference coordinated attacks on multiple military installations, with specific mention of Fort Braxton, Camp Pendleton, and Norfolk Naval Base. Agent Mitchell leaned forward, studying the translations. "These communication patterns match what we've been tracking in our own investigations. The FBI has identified at least 12 individuals with direct connections to international terrorist organizations who have entered the country in the past 6 months. That's what makes this different," Allyson continued. "We're not dealing with lone wolves or domestic extremists. This is a coordinated international operation designed to strike at the heart of American military capability. The attacks are planned for the 4th of July weekend, when security is traditionally heightened but personnel are at reduced levels due to holiday leave." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison consulted his tablet, Captain, intelligence reports indicate these groups have been conducting surveillance of base security procedures for months. They know our patrol schedules, our access points, and our response protocols. This suggests either inside information or extremely sophisticated reconnaissance capabilities. Both, Allyson replied grimly. We have evidence that at least one individual with base access has been providing information to the terrorist cells. We also know they've been using commercial drones to conduct aerial surveillance and have infiltrated local businesses that provide services to the base. Master Sergeant Thompson spoke up for the first time. Ma'am, if they have that level of intelligence about our operations, traditional security measures won't be sufficient. We'll need to completely revise our protocols and assume that everything they know about our standard procedures is compromised. Exactly, Sergeant. That's why this task force exists. We need to think like our enemies, anticipate their tactics, and develop countermeasures they won't expect. Allyson pulled up another slide showing a timeline of intercepted activities. Based on the intelligence patterns, we believe the attacks will involve multiple teams hitting different targets simultaneously. Their goal isn't just to cause casualties. It's to demonstrate that American military installations are vulnerable to coordinated assault. Agent Rodriguez had been studying the surveillance photos intently. Captain, DHS has been tracking several individuals who match the profiles of known operatives. The problem is that they've been extremely careful to avoid any activities that would justify arrest or detention. They're following all laws, maintaining legitimate covers, and operating with a level of discipline that suggests professional training. Which brings us to our first major challenge, Allyson said. We can't simply arrest people for being suspicious. We need actionable intelligence that will allow us to prevent the attacks while building cases that will hold up in court. This means we need to get inside their operational planning without alerting them to our investigation. Major Davis frowned. Captain, that sounds like you're talking about covert operations on American soil. The military has very specific limitations on domestic activities, and coordination with civilian law enforcement is complicated by jurisdictional issues. You're absolutely right, Major. That's why this task force includes representatives from multiple agencies with different authorities and capabilities. The FBI and DHS can conduct activities that the military cannot, while we can provide resources and expertise that civilian agencies lack. The key is seamless coordination without stepping on each other's jurisdictions. Agent Mitchell nodded slowly. I've worked at joint operations before, but never with this level of complexity. We're essentially asking different agencies with different rules and different objectives to function as a single unit. That's extremely difficult even under the best circumstances. It is difficult, Allyson acknowledged, but it's also necessary. These terrorists are counting on the fact that our agencies don't communicate effectively, and that our standard procedures create predictable patterns they can exploit. Our advantage is that they don't know we've identified their operational plan, and they don't expect this level of coordination between military and civilian authorities. She changed the display to show a map of Fort Braxton, with various locations highlighted in different colors. Based on the intelligence we've gathered, we believe their primary target is the base's ammunition depot. Secondary targets include the airfield and the command center. The timing suggests they plan to strike during the 4th of July ceremony, when maximum personnel will be concentrated in the parade ground area. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison studied the map carefully. If they hit the ammunition depot, the explosion would be visible for miles and would cause massive casualties even beyond the immediate blast zone. The psychological impact would be enormous, showing that terrorists can strike at the heart of American military power. Which is exactly why we can't let it happen, Allyson said firmly. Over the next 3 days, we'll be implementing new security protocols that appear routine but are actually designed to force the terrorist cells to adapt their plans. We'll be monitoring their communications, tracking their movements, and identifying their support network. Master Sergeant Thompson raised her hand. Ma'am, if we change security procedures suddenly, won't that alert them that we're aware of their plans? Not if we do it correctly. The changes need to appear as routine security updates or responses to general threat assessments. Nothing that would suggest we have specific knowledge of their operation. Allyson pulled up a detailed timeline. Major Davis, I need your team to conduct random security sweeps that are actually targeted at areas where we suspect surveillance equipment has been placed. Agent Mitchell, The FBI needs to increase monitoring of the suspected operatives without making it obvious they're under investigation. The room fell silent as the team members absorbed the complexity of what they were being asked to accomplish. Agent Rodriguez finally spoke. "Captain, this plan requires perfect coordination and perfect timing. If any agency acts too early or too aggressively, we could spook the terrorists into accelerating their timeline or changing their targets." "That's the risk we face," Allyson agreed. "But the alternative is allowing a coordinated terrorist attack on American soil that could kill hundreds of people and undermine confidence in military security nationwide. The stakes are too high for anything less than our best effort." Major Davis studied Allyson with new interest. "Captain, you're talking about this operation like you've run similar missions before. Your personnel file doesn't show the kind of experience that would prepare someone for this level of complexity." It was the question Allyson had been dreading and expecting. She met Major Davis's gaze steadily. "Major, I understand your concerns about my background. I'm asking you to judge me based on the results we achieved together, not on what you think you know about my experience." The response clearly didn't satisfy Major Davis, but before she could press further, Agent Mitchell interjected. "Regardless of anyone's background, we need to focus on the mission. The intelligence is solid, the threat is real, and we have less than 2 weeks to prevent a major terrorist attack. Personal credentials matter less than effective execution." "Agent Mitchell is right," Allyson said. "We can discuss my qualifications after we've prevented these attacks. Right now, I need each of you to brief your teams and begin implementing the security changes we've discussed. We'll meet again tomorrow at 0600 to review progress and adjust our approach based on any new intelligence." As the team members gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Allyson caught Major Davis lingering near the door. The Major approached with the measured stride of someone who had something important to say. "Captain," Major Davis said quietly, "I meant what I said about your—" But those experiences existed in classified files that she couldn't reference, which meant she'd have to earn her team's trust through performance rather than credentials. It was a challenge she'd faced before, but never with quite so much at stake and never with so little time to prove herself. The real test would begin tomorrow, when theory became action and lives hung in the balance of every decision she made. The surveillance van parked outside Manny's auto repair looked like any other commercial vehicle on the busy street 3 miles from Fort Braxton. Inside, Captain Allyson Jones sat hunched over a bank of monitoring equipment, listening to Arabic conversations through high-end headphones, while Agent Sarah Mitchell tracked vehicle movements on her laptop. It was their 3rd day of round-the-clock surveillance, and the intelligence they'd gathered was both encouraging and terrifying. "Contact moving," Agent Mitchell whispered, adjusting her camera lens. "Black sedan, Georgia plates Echo 779, Charlie Mike Delta." Through the van's tinted windows, they watched as a man in his 30s emerged from the auto repair shop and walked toward the sedan with the casual confidence of someone who believed he was unobserved. Allyson recognized him immediately from the intelligence photos. Rashid al-Mahmoud, a Syrian national who'd entered the United States 6 months earlier on a student visa to study engineering at the University of Georgia. What his university records didn't show was his 3-year association with a terrorist cell that had been responsible for attacks on American interests in the Middle East. "He's carrying something," Mitchell observed, zooming in with her telephoto lens. "Looks like technical documents, possibly blueprints." The camera clicked rapidly as she captured al-Mahmoud placing a manila envelope in the sedan's back seat before checking his surroundings with the practiced eye of someone trained in counter-surveillance. Through her headphones, Allyson heard the crackle of al-Mahmoud's radio as he contacted his handler. The conversation was brief and conducted in a dialect of Arabic that confirmed her suspicions about his origins. "He's reporting completion of Phase 2 surveillance," she translated quietly for Mitchell. "Says the obstacles are manageable and the timeline remains viable." The sedan pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic, heading toward the interstate that would take it back toward Fort Braxton. In the passenger seat of their surveillance van, Agent Rodriguez started the engine and began following at a discreet distance, coordinating with other FBI units positioned along the likely route. "This is significant intelligence," Mitchell said, reviewing the photographs she'd captured. "If those are blueprints of base infrastructure, it confirms they have inside information about our security systems." She paused, studying Allyson's expression. "Captain, you look like you've seen this before." It was an observation that hit closer to the truth than Mitchell realized. Allyson had indeed seen this before. The careful surveillance, the technical reconnaissance, the methodical preparation that preceded major terrorist operations. She'd observed similar patterns in Kabul, Damascus, and Baghdad, often from much closer range than the relative safety of a surveillance van. Terrorist cells follow predictable patterns, Allyson replied carefully. The key is identifying which phase of their operation they're in and disrupting it before they can execute their attack. She adjusted her headphones as new chatter came through the monitoring equipment. Rodriguez, they're discussing a meeting tonight at a warehouse location. I need you to coordinate with DHS to identify all commercial properties within a 5-mile radius that match the description they're using. The warehouse turned out to be an abandoned textile facility in an industrial district that had seen better days. By 1,900 hours, Allyson's team had established overwatch positions in 3 different buildings, with sightlines that covered all approaches to the target location. The operation required careful coordination between military personnel who weren't technically authorized to conduct domestic surveillance and civilian agencies who lacked the specialized equipment and training for this type of mission. Major Davis had positioned her Special Forces team in an office building 2 blocks away, equipped with long-range observation equipment and ready to provide tactical support if the situation escalated beyond surveillance. Echo 1 to Control, her voice crackled through the encrypted radio network. I have eyes on the target building. Counting at least 6 individuals inside, with more arriving every few minutes. From her position in a vacant apartment across the street, Allyson watched through binoculars as vehicles continued to arrive at the warehouse. The license plates represented 6 different states, suggesting that the terrorist network was far more extensive than their initial intelligence had indicated. Control to all units, she whispered into her radio. Maintain observation only. We need to identify as many participants as possible before taking any action. Agent Mitchell's voice came through the earpiece from her position covering the warehouse's rear entrance. Captain, I'm seeing weapons being unloaded from one of the vehicles. This isn't just a planning meeting. They're distributing equipment for immediate use. The development changed the calculus of the operation significantly. If the terrorists were taking possession of weapons, it meant they were moving toward the execution phase of their plan faster than anticipated. Allyson found herself facing the kind of split-second decision that could determine whether people lived or died. All units, maintain position, she ordered, fighting every instinct that told her to move immediately. We need more intelligence before we act. She knew that premature action could scatter the terrorist network and force them to accelerate their timeline, potentially making them even more dangerous. Through her binoculars, she watched as Al-Mahmoud emerged from the warehouse and began directing the positioning of vehicles around the building's perimeter. His movements were those of someone with military training, suggesting that the terrorist cell included individuals with combat experience who understood tactical operations. Control, this is Echo 2, came Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's voice from the intelligence center back at Fort Braxton. We're picking up increased chatter on monitored frequencies. The subjects are discussing final preparations and 0-hour confirmation. It sounds like they're preparing to move to operational status. The radio crackled with Agent Rodriguez's voice from his mobile surveillance position. Captain, we've identified the weapons being distributed. Looks like assault rifles, explosives, and what appears to be military-grade communications equipment. These aren't improvised devices. This is professional-level armament. Allyson felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with high-stakes operations where every decision carried life-or-death consequences. She'd experienced this sensation before, in places where American interests were under threat, and where failure meant not just personal consequences, but potential loss of innocent life. Echo 1, what's your assessment of tactical options if we need to interdict? She asked Major Davis. Building has multiple exits, unknown number of combatants, and we're operating. The situation was escalating beyond what could be handled through surveillance alone. Allyson realized she was facing the moment that every commander dreaded, the decision point where inaction became as dangerous as action and where the wrong choice could result in either blown operations or preventable casualties. Control to Echo 1, she said quietly. Prepare for possible tactical intervention. Rules of engagement are defensive only, unless direct threat to civilian life is observed. She paused, weighing options that all carried serious risks. All other units, Continue observation and intelligence gathering. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with before we commit to action. From her observation post, she watched Al-Mahmoud consulting what appeared to be architectural drawings while pointing toward different areas of the warehouse. His body language suggested someone briefing others on specific operational roles, which meant they were looking at the final planning phase before mission execution. Agent Rodriguez's voice cut through the radio chatter. "Captain, we're seeing preparation activities consistent with immediate departure. Whatever they're planning, it looks like it's happening tonight." The intelligence was unambiguous. The terrorist cell was moving from planning to execution, and their target was a military installation filled with personnel who had no idea what was coming. Allyson found herself facing the kind of decision that separated theoretical leadership from real command responsibility. "All units stand by for operational orders," she said into her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "We're moving from surveillance to active interdiction. Echo 1, prepare for coordinated action on my command." Major Davis's response carried a new note of respect. "Echo 1, standing by. Ready to execute on your order, Captain." As Allyson watched a terrorist cell make final preparations for what appeared to be an immediate attack on Fort Braxton, she realized that the theoretical mission planning of the past 3 days was about to become a life-or-death test of her ability to command under pressure. The stakes couldn't be higher, and failure wasn't an option that anyone would survive. The decision came with crystalline clarity that surprised even Allyson. As she watched Al-Mahmoud begin loading what appeared to be detonation devices into multiple vehicles, the tactical situation shifted from surveillance to imminent threat prevention. The terrorists weren't planning an attack for July 4th. They were executing a preliminary strike tonight to test base security responses and position themselves for the larger operation. "All units, this is Control," she said into her radio, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made similar calls in much more dangerous circumstances. "We have positive identification of explosive devices and confirmed intent to attack Fort Braxton infrastructure. Authorization to interdict is granted." Repeat, authorization to interdict is granted. Major Davis's response was immediate. "Echo 1 copies, moving to assault positions." Through her binoculars, Allyson could see the Major's team emerging from concealment with the fluid precision of operators who'd done this countless times before. Their movements were coordinated and purposeful, suggesting a level of training that went far beyond standard military preparation. Agent Mitchell's voice crackled through the communications network. "FBI units in position at rear exit. I count 4 vehicles preparing to depart, with at least 3 individuals per vehicle. They're armed and appear to be following a rehearsed departure protocol." The warehouse had become a hive of activity as the terrorist cell prepared to split into multiple teams. Allyson recognized the pattern. It was a classic cell division designed to ensure that if one team was compromised, the others could continue with modified versions of the original plan. She'd seen identical tactics used by insurgent groups in Iraq and Afghanistan, where operational security meant the difference between successful attacks and complete mission failure. "Rodriguez, I need immediate coordination with local law enforcement to establish perimeter blocks at Jefferson Avenue and Industrial Boulevard," she ordered. "These teams are going to scatter the moment they realize they're under surveillance. We need to contain them before they can disperse." Through her headphones, she heard increasingly urgent Arabic chatter as the terrorist cell leaders discussed timing and coordination. What she heard made her realize that the situation was even more complex than they'd anticipated. The warehouse meeting wasn't just about Fort Braxton. The terrorists were coordinating simultaneous operations against multiple targets, with Fort Braxton serving as the primary objective and civilian infrastructure as secondary targets designed to overwhelm emergency response capabilities. "Priority intelligence update," she announced to all units. "Subjects are discussing coordinated strikes on civilian targets, including the water treatment facility and the electrical substation serving the county. This is a multi-vector attack designed to cause maximum disruption and civilian casualties." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's voice came through from the intelligence center. "Captain, if they hit both military and civilian infrastructure simultaneously, emergency services will be completely overwhelmed. The casualties could number in the hundreds, and the psychological impact would be devastating." Allyson felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on her shoulders. She'd experienced this before in forward operating bases, where intelligence suggested imminent attacks on both military personnel and civilian populations. The key was disrupting the terrorist network's coordination while minimizing the risk of scattered cells continuing with modified attacks. Echo 1, what's your tactical assessment for simultaneous interdiction of all 4 vehicles? She asked Major Davis. Challenging but doable, Davis replied. My team can take the warehouse and the 2 vehicles in the parking area. FBI and DHS units can interdict the vehicles already departed if we can coordinate timing precisely. The key is hitting everyone simultaneously so they can't warn each other. Agent Mitchell's voice carried new urgency. Captain, one of the vehicles just left heading toward the industrial district. If they reach the electrical substation before we can stop them, they'll have a clear shot at critical infrastructure. The tactical situation was becoming more complex by the minute, with multiple moving pieces that required perfect coordination to prevent catastrophic failure. Allyson realized she was facing the kind of multi-dimensional crisis that tested every aspect of her training and experience. Rodriguez, redirect your mobile unit to intercept the vehicle heading toward electrical infrastructure, she ordered. Mitchell, coordinate with Echo 1 for synchronized warehouse assault. I'm moving to Overwatch position to provide tactical coordination. As she gathered her equipment and prepared to relocate, Allyson's radio crackled with Colonel Garrett's voice from Fort Braxton Command Center. Control, this is Base Command. We're monitoring your operation and standing by to provide additional support if needed. What's your assessment of threat level to base personnel? It was the first time Colonel Garrett had communicated directly during the operation, and Allyson could hear the tension in his voice. The base commander was watching his young captain coordinate a complex counterterrorism operation that could determine whether hundreds of his personnel lived or died. Base Command, threat level is immediate and confirmed, she replied while moving to a new observation position. We have positive identification of explosive devices and confirmed terrorist intent to attack ammunition depot and command facilities. Recommend immediate implementation of Threat Condition Delta protocols. Understood. Control. Threat Condition Delta is now in effect. All personnel are moving to secure positions and all base access points are sealed. Garrett paused. Captain, we're counting on you to stop this before it reaches our gates. The weight of that responsibility drove home the stakes of what they were attempting. Allyson reached her new position, a fire escape that provided sight lines to both the warehouse and the main access road, just as the coordinated interdiction began. Major Davis's voice cut through the radio chatter with military precision. Echo 1 going active. Breach, breach, breach. The warehouse erupted in controlled chaos as her Special Forces team moved through multiple entry points simultaneously. Flashbang grenades strobed through the windows, followed immediately by the distinctive sound of coordinated room clearing. From her elevated position, Allyson could see the tactical situation developing in real time. 2 terrorist operatives emerged from the warehouse's side entrance, carrying what appeared to be detonation equipment, only to be confronted by FBI agents who'd anticipated exactly that movement. The terrorists' military training was evident in their immediate defensive response, but they were facing operators whose skills matched or exceeded their own. Contact front. Major Davis's voice carried the sharp edge of someone engaged in active combat. Multiple armed subjects, military-level resistance. We have 1 down, 3 still active inside the warehouse. Agent Mitchell's position at the rear of the building erupted in gunfire as more terrorists attempted to escape through what they'd believed was an unmonitored exit. Subjects are better armed than anticipated, she reported through the sound of automatic weapons fire. Professional-grade equipment and tactics. These aren't amateur terrorists. Through her binoculars, Allyson watched the tactical situation evolve with the fluid precision of a well-rehearsed operation. Her team was performing exactly as trained, but the terrorist cell was proving more formidable than their intelligence had suggested. The operatives were responding to pressure with discipline and coordination that indicated significant combat experience. Agent Rodriguez's voice came through the radio from his pursuit of the departed vehicle. Mobile unit has eyes on target vehicle approaching electrical substation. Subject appears to be conducting final reconnaissance before initiating attack. Request permission to interdict before they reach critical infrastructure. Permission granted, Allyson responded immediately. All necessary force authorized to prevent infrastructure attack. She knew that if the terrorists succeeded in damaging the electrical grid, the resulting blackout would create chaos that could be exploited for additional attack. The discovery confirmed Allyson's worst fears about the scope of the terrorist operation. This wasn't a simple attack on military infrastructure. It was a coordinated assault designed to cause maximum civilian casualties and create widespread panic. The kind of operation that required months of planning and significant financial backing. Agent Rodriguez's voice cut through the communications with urgent news. Target vehicle interdicted successfully. Subject in custody, explosive device secured. Found detailed blueprints of electrical substation and timing devices set for 2,200 hours. They were planning to hit civilian infrastructure tonight as a preliminary to the main attack. Copy that, Rodriguez. Excellent work. Allyson felt another piece of the tactical puzzle falling into place. The terrorists had been planning a two-phase operation. Tonight's infrastructure attacks to create chaos and overwhelm emergency services, followed by the main assault on Fort Braxton when response capabilities were degraded. Major Davis's voice came through with the distinctive tone of someone who'd just achieved a significant tactical objective. Echo 1 has cleared the entire warehouse. 2 additional subjects in custody. No casualties to friendly forces. We've secured enough explosives to supply a small war, plus detailed operational plans for attacks on multiple civilian and military targets. The warehouse operation was complete, but Allyson knew they'd only intercepted part of the terrorist network. The intelligence they'd gathered suggested a larger organization with cells operating in multiple states, coordinated by handlers who remained at large. All units outstanding performance, she said into a radio. Begin evidence collection and subject interrogation. We need immediate intelligence on additional cells and operational timelines. She paused, watching as emergency vehicles began arriving at the scene. Base command, immediate threat to Fort Braxton has been neutralized, but recommend maintaining threat condition Delta until we can confirm the full scope of the terrorist network. Colonel Garrett's response carried a note of amazement. Understood, Control. Captain, that was exceptional coordination. We'll maintain heightened security until you can brief us on the intelligence you've gathered. As the immediate crisis subsided, Allyson found herself standing on the fire escape, watching her team coordinate the aftermath of a successful counterterrorism operation. The tactical precision with which they'd moved from surveillance to interdiction had prevented what could have been one of the most devastating terrorist attacks on American soil since September 11th. But even as she felt satisfaction at the operation's success, she knew that Colonel Garrett and her team were probably wondering how a supposedly inexperienced captain had coordinated such a complex mission with the skill of a seasoned special operations commander. The classified truth of her background was about to become much harder to conceal. The interrogation rooms at Fort Braxton's intelligence facility buzzed with activity at 03:00 hours as Captain Allyson Jones reviewed the intelligence haul from the warehouse operation. What they'd discovered painted a picture far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. The terrorist network wasn't just planning attacks on American soil. They were conducting what appeared to be a test run for a much larger coordinated assault planned for major cities across the country. Sitting across from her in the secure briefing room, Agent Sarah Mitchell spread out documents recovered from the warehouse. Captain, these operational plans are incredibly sophisticated. We're looking at targeting analysis for infrastructure in 12 major metropolitan areas, with Fort Braxton serving as the proof of concept for their methodology. The documents were a terrorist's nightmare made manifest, detailed blueprints of power grids, water treatment facilities, transportation hubs, and military installations. Colonel Garrett entered the briefing room with the measured stride of someone who'd been awake for 24 hours straight. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, loosened collar, slight stubble, eyes that held the weight of recent revelations. He took a seat at the conference table and looked directly at Allyson with an expression that suggested his entire understanding of her capabilities had been fundamentally altered. Captain Jones, he began slowly, I've been reviewing the after-action reports from tonight's operation. What I'm reading doesn't match what I thought I knew about your background. He paused, studying her face for any reaction. The tactical coordination you demonstrated, the real-time decision-making under pressure, the way you anticipated terrorist countermeasures, that's not the kind of expertise you develop from desk assignments and training exercises. Allyson had been expecting this conversation since the moment she'd made the decision to authorize the warehouse interdiction. Her classified background was becoming harder to conceal, as each successful operation demonstrated capabilities that couldn't be explained by her official personnel record. Sir, I understand your questions about my experience. What I can tell you is that I've been thoroughly prepared for this type of mission through specialized training programs that aren't reflected in standard personnel files. It was technically true, though it vastly understated the reality of her 6 years operating in some of the most dangerous counterterrorism missions the United States had ever conducted. The specialized training had included everything from deep cover infiltration of terrorist cells to coordinating multinational special operations that prevented attacks on civilian populations in 3 different countries. Major Rebecca Davis, who'd been quietly reviewing tactical assessments, looked up from her reports. "Captain, with respect, tonight wasn't about training. The way you read that tactical situation, the predictions you made about terrorist movement patterns, the coordination protocols you implemented, that's operational experience. Real operational experience." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison consulted his secure tablet. "I've been authorized to share some additional intelligence that might explain the captain's extensive capabilities." He paused, glancing at Allyson. "Captain, your operational security clearance allows me to discuss certain aspects of your background that weren't previously available to the team." Allyson felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She'd been walking a tightrope between operational necessity and classification requirements, and it was becoming clear that maintaining her cover was no longer possible given the scope of what they were facing. "Over the past 6 years," Harrison continued, "Captain Jones has been involved in classified counterterrorism operations across multiple theaters. Her official assignments have served as cover for her actual role as a special operations officer working directly with Pentagon intelligence services." The room fell silent as the implications of that revelation settled over the team. Colonel Garrett's expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching awe as he realized the caliber of officer he'd been questioning. "The missions she's conducted," Harrison went on, "include infiltrating terrorist cells in Afghanistan, coordinating with international intelligence services to prevent attacks in Europe, and developing the tactical protocols we used tonight to disrupt coordinated terrorist operations." Agent Mitchell leaned back in her chair, studying Allyson with new understanding. "That explains how you knew exactly what communication patterns to look for and how to predict their operational timeline. You've seen this before. Not in training exercises, but in actual operations where lives were on the line." Major Davis shook her head slowly. "Captain, when I questioned your experience, I was thinking about conventional military backgrounds. I had no idea we were dealing with someone who's been running black operations for the better part of a decade." The classified nature of Allyson's actual experience created an interesting dynamic in the room. Her team was beginning to understand that they'd been working with someone whose operational capabilities far exceeded anything they'd encountered in conventional military service, but the specific details of her missions remained locked behind classification levels that most of them couldn't access. "What matters now," Allyson said, redirecting the conversation toward immediate concerns, "is that tonight's operation has revealed a terrorist network that's far more extensive and sophisticated than our initial intelligence suggested. The documents we recovered indicate that Fort Braxton was just one target in a much larger coordinated assault." She activated the room's display system and pulled up a map showing the locations mentioned in the captured operational plans. "They're planning simultaneous attacks on military installations and civilian infrastructure in 12 cities. Time to create maximum psychological impact and overwhelm emergency response capabilities nationwide." Colonel Garrett studied the map with growing alarm. "Captain, if they execute coordinated attacks on this scale, we're looking at potential casualties in the thousands and economic disruption that could last for months." "Which is why we can't stop with tonight's success," Allyson replied. "The operatives we captured are providing intelligence about the larger network, but we need to move quickly before the other cells realize their communications have been compromised." Agent Rodriguez consulted his notes from the interrogations. The subjects we're questioning are revealing information about handlers operating out of major metropolitan areas, with coordination apparently coming from international sources. This isn't a domestic terrorist organization. It's an international operation using the United States as a target-rich environment. The scope of the threat was becoming clearer with each piece of intelligence they analyzed. The terrorist network had been operating for months, possibly years, building the infrastructure necessary to conduct coordinated attacks that would demonstrate American vulnerability on a scale not seen since September 11th. "There's something else," Agent Mitchell said, reviewing reports from the FBI's analysis of the captured communications equipment. "The encryption protocols they were using are extremely sophisticated. Military-grade security that suggests they had access to advanced technology and technical expertise." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison nodded grimly. The communications analysis indicates that the terrorist cells have been in contact with handlers who possess detailed knowledge of American intelligence gathering capabilities. They've been operating under the assumption that standard law enforcement surveillance methods wouldn't detect their activities. They didn't count on us, Major Davis observed. The combination of military special operations and civilian law enforcement working with complete coordination isn't something they planned for. Allyson appreciated the Major's confidence, but she knew that their success tonight was just the beginning of what would likely be a much larger and more complex operation. The intelligence we've gathered gives us a window of opportunity, but it's closing rapidly. Once the other cells realize that their communications have been compromised, they'll either accelerate their timeline or disperse to avoid detection. Colonel Garrett stood up and walked to the map display, studying the distribution of potential targets. Captain, based on what we've learned tonight, what's your assessment of our next operational priorities? It was a question that acknowledged her expertise and experience in a way that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours earlier. The successful coordination of the warehouse operation had demonstrated capabilities that couldn't be explained by conventional military training. Sir, we need to expand this task force to include federal agencies with jurisdiction in all 12 target cities, Allyson replied. We also need immediate coordination with international intelligence services to identify and disrupt the overseas support network that's funding and directing these operations. She paused, considering the complexity of what she was proposing. Most importantly, we need to move fast. The terrorist network has been planning this for months. We have days, possibly hours, before they realize their security has been compromised and adapt their operations accordingly. Agent Rodriguez checked his secure phone. I'm getting reports from DHS that suspicious activities have been detected in 6 of the cities identified in the captured documents. It looks like the terrorist cells are already moving toward operational status. The intelligence was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it confirmed the accuracy of what they'd discovered. Terrifying because it meant the coordinated attacks were imminent rather than weeks away. Colonel, Allyson said, I need authorization to coordinate with Pentagon intelligence services and expand this operation to a national level. What we're facing is beyond the scope of what any single installation can handle. Garrett nodded slowly. Captain, after tonight's performance, you have whatever authorization you need. Just tell me what you need to stop these attacks. As the briefing concluded and team members began implementing expanded operational plans, Allyson realized that her cover as an inexperienced officer was permanently blown. But given the scope of the threat they were facing, that might be exactly what the mission required. The Pentagon's Crisis Operations Center hummed with controlled intensity as Captain Allyson Jones found herself at the center of the largest domestic counterterrorism operation since 9/11. Banks of monitors displayed real-time intelligence from 12 cities, while encrypted communications linked her with field teams, intelligence analysts, and senior officials who were beginning to grasp the true scope of what they were confronting. General Patricia Hawkins, the Joint Chiefs counterterrorism specialist, studied the tactical displays with the focused attention of someone who'd spent 30 years preventing exactly this type of scenario. Captain Jones, she said without looking away from the screens, in 6 hours you've gone from local base security to coordinating a national-level response. That's either exceptional adaptability or prior experience with operations of this magnitude. Allyson stood before the massive situation board, watching as red indicators marked terrorist cell activities across the country. Each blinking light represented a potential catastrophe that could kill hundreds of people and fundamentally alter American perceptions of domestic security. Ma'am, the situation required rapid escalation of our response capabilities, she replied carefully. The intelligence we gathered indicated that any delay would allow the terrorist network to either execute their attacks or disperse beyond our ability to track them. What she didn't say was that she'd coordinated similar multi-city operations twice before, once to prevent coordinated bombings in European capitals, and once to disrupt a network planning simultaneous attacks on American embassies across the Middle East. Those experiences had taught her that terrorist networks operating at this scale required aggressive, coordinated responses that overwhelmed their ability. General Hawkins consulted her tablet. Captain, coordinating simultaneous operations across 12 cities requires resources and authority that typically take weeks to arrange. How do you propose to achieve tactical synchronization across multiple time zones with less than 4 hours of preparation time? It was a fair question that highlighted the complexity of what they were attempting. Traditional multi-agency coordination involved extensive planning, jurisdictional negotiations, and careful resource allocation that could take days or weeks to implement properly. Ma'am were using the existing federal emergency response infrastructure, but adapting it for offensive counterterrorism operations rather than defensive emergency management, Allyson explained. Each city's FBI field office serves as the coordination hub, with local law enforcement providing support and military assets positioned for backup if civilian authorities need additional capabilities. She activated a display showing the operational framework they'd implemented. The key is standardized communication protocols and simplified command structures that allow for real-time coordination without extensive bureaucratic oversight. Colonel Garrett's voice came through from Fort Braxton, where he was coordinating military support for the national operation. Command, this is Base Actual. We're receiving reports that terrorist communications traffic has increased significantly in the past hour. It appears they're aware that something has changed and are moving toward accelerated execution of their plans. The development was exactly what Allyson had feared. Terrorist networks operating at this level of sophistication typically included security protocols that would detect disruptions to their operational environment. The successful interdiction at Fort Braxton had probably triggered alarm signals throughout the entire organization. All field teams, priority update, she announced through the National Communications Network. Subject organizations appear to be moving toward immediate execution of planned attacks. Recommend moving to operational readiness for simultaneous interdiction within the next 2 hours. Agent Rodriguez's voice came through from Los Angeles. Command LA team confirms accelerated activity at our target location. Subjects are loading vehicles and appears to be conducting final equipment checks. If they're moving to execution phase, we're looking at potential attacks within hours rather than days. The intelligence confirmed that the terrorist network was adapting to the changed operational environment by accelerating their timeline. It was a calculated risk that demonstrated both their operational sophistication and their commitment to executing attacks regardless of security complications. Major Davis, now positioned with a Special Forces team in Atlanta, reported similar observations. Atlanta team seeing identical patterns. Multiple vehicles being loaded with equipment. Subjects conducting what appears to be final operational briefings. They're definitely moving toward execution phase. General Hawkins studied the pattern of reports coming in from all 12 cities. Captain, if they execute coordinated attacks in the next few hours, we're looking at potential casualties in the thousands and infrastructure damage that could affect millions of people. Are you confident that we can prevent attacks across 12 cities simultaneously? It was the question that every counterterrorism professional dreaded. The moment when theoretical planning met operational reality and lives hung in the balance of tactical decisions made under extreme time pressure. Ma'am, based on the intelligence we've gathered and the resources we have positioned, I believe we can prevent the majority of planned attacks, Allyson replied. However, the scale of the operation means that some cells may succeed in initiating attacks before we can interdict them. She paused. Considering the weight of what she was acknowledging, the goal is to minimize casualties and prevent the coordinated impact that the terrorist network is counting on to create maximum psychological effect. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's voice came through from the Pentagon's Intelligence Center. Command, we're detecting significant changes in the encrypted communications patterns used by the terrorist network. It appears they're implementing emergency protocols designed to maintain coordination even if primary communication channels are compromised. The development suggested that the terrorist organization included individuals with advanced training in operational security and crisis management. They weren't simply accelerating their timeline. They were adapting their entire operational structure to function under compromised conditions. All teams updated tactical assessment, Allyson announced. Subject organizations are implementing advanced security protocols that indicate professional-level training and preparation. Expect increased resistance and sophisticated countermeasures during interdiction operations. Agent Mitchell's report from Chicago carried new urgency. Command, Chicago team has identified what appears to be the network's primary coordination center. We're observing individuals who match intelligence profiles of known international terrorist operatives. This isn't just a domestic cell. We're looking at direct involvement of experienced international actors. The revelation fundamentally changed the nature of what they were confronting. Instead of a domestic terrorist network with international support, They were dealing with an international terrorist operation being conducted on American soil with local support. Chicago team, maintain surveillance and prepare for priority interdiction, Allyson ordered. Capture of coordination leadership is now primary mission objective for overall operation success. General Hawkins consulted with her advisors before addressing the operational situation. Captain, given the international implications of what we're facing, this operation now has presidential-level attention. You have authority to coordinate with any federal, state, or local agencies necessary to prevent these attacks. The authorization was both empowering and sobering. Allyson now had access to resources and authorities that were typically reserved for the most senior counterterrorism officials, but she also carried responsibility for an operation that could determine whether hundreds of Americans lived or died. Understood, ma'am, all teams. This is command with final operational orders, she announced through the national network. Coordinated interdiction will commence at 1,400 hours Eastern Time. All teams will move simultaneously to prevent communication between cells. Agent Rodriguez confirmed from Los Angeles. At exactly 1,400 hours Eastern Time, 12 American cities erupted into coordinated action as Operation Thunderstrike commenced with military precision. In the Pentagon's Crisis Operations Center, Captain Allyson Jones stood before a wall of monitors, displaying real-time feeds from FBI tactical teams, local SWAT units, and military special operations forces as they moved against terrorist cells that had been planning the largest coordinated attack on American soil since September 11th. Chicago team, contact! Agent Mitchell's voice crackled through the communications network as her team breached the coordination center that intelligence had identified as the nerve hub for the entire operation. The sound of flashbang grenades and automatic weapons fire filled the audio feed as the most critical interdiction of the operation began. Through the tactical camera feeds, Allyson watched as the Chicago team encountered resistance that confirmed their intelligence about professional-level terrorist operatives. The subjects weren't simply armed civilians. They were responding to the assault with coordinated defensive tactics that indicated military training and combat experience. Command, Chicago team has encountered fortified positions and military-grade weapons, Mitchell reported between bursts of gunfire. These subjects are fighting like professional soldiers, not amateur terrorists. We're going to need additional tactical support to complete the interdiction. General Hawkins consulted her tactical advisors before responding. Chicago team, military backup is en route. Maintain pressure and prevent subject escape or destruction of intelligence materials. Simultaneously, reports were flooding in from the other 11 cities as teams moved against their assigned targets. The pattern emerging was both encouraging and alarming. The terrorist cells were being caught in the act of final preparation for their attacks, confirming the accuracy of the intelligence. But their level of resistance suggested a much more formidable enemy than anyone had anticipated. Los Angeles team subjects attempting vehicle escape with explosive devices, Agent Rodriguez reported from the West Coast operation. We've interdicted 2 vehicles, but a third departed the target location before we could establish perimeter control. Vehicle is heading toward what appears to be the Los Angeles International Airport. The development sent alarm bells through the operations center. If terrorists with explosive devices reached LAX during peak travel hours, the potential casualties could number in the hundreds, even if they only partially succeeded in their attack. LA team, coordinate with airport security and air traffic control for immediate lockdown procedures, Allyson ordered. Priority interdiction of escaped vehicle before it reaches airport perimeter. Major Davis's voice came through from Atlanta with a mix of success and concern. Atlanta team has secured primary target location and taken 4 subjects into custody. However, we've discovered evidence that suggests additional cells operating in the southeast that weren't identified in the original intelligence. The possibility of unidentified terrorist cells added a new dimension of complexity to an operation that was already stretching resources across 12 cities. Allyson realized they might be dealing with a network even larger than their most pessimistic estimates had suggested. Atlanta team, secure all intelligence materials and prepare for immediate analysis, she responded. We need to identify any additional cells before they can adapt their operations or disperse. The tactical feeds from New York showed a different type of challenge as the FBI team encountered what appeared to be an abandoned safe house. New York team reporting target location appears to have been evacuated within the past few hours, came the report from the field commander. Evidence suggests hasty departure, but subjects and equipment are gone. It was exactly the kind of development that Allyson had feared. Some cells had detected the compromise of their network security and had dispersed before the coordinated interdiction could reach them. The question was whether they had abandoned their attack plans entirely or had simply relocated to execute modified operations. New York team, expand search to secondary locations identified in the intelligence analysis, she ordered. Subjects may have relocated to backup positions. The variation in resistance levels across different cities suggested that the terrorist network included cells with different levels of training and preparation. Some were responding like professional military units, while others appeared to be less experienced operatives who had been overwhelmed by the coordinated law enforcement response. Miami team subjects have barricaded themselves in the target building and are threatening to detonate explosive devices, came an urgent report from the Florida operation. We have confirmation of civilian hostages and devices with immediate detonation capability. The hostage situation fundamentally changed the tactical calculus for the Miami operation. Any attempt to storm the building could result in civilian casualties, but allowing the terrorists to maintain control gave them time to either escape or execute their original attack plans. Miami team establish containment perimeter and initiate hostage negotiation protocols, Allyson ordered. Priority is civilian safety while maintaining pressure to prevent terrorist escape. General Hawkins studied the tactical situation developing across multiple cities. Captain, we're seeing success in most locations, but the variations in resistance and the complexity of some situations suggest this operation is going to require hours rather than minutes to complete successfully. From the Pentagon Intelligence Center, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison provided a strategic assessment. Based on the intelligence being recovered from secured locations, we're looking at a terrorist network that was planning coordinated attacks designed to cripple transportation infrastructure, disrupt power grids, and create maximum civilian casualties during July 4th celebrations. The scope of what they were preventing became clearer with each intelligence report. The terrorists hadn't simply been planning attacks on military installations. They had been preparing to strike at the heart of American civilian infrastructure in a way that would have paralyzed major cities and created nationwide panic. Chicago team, breakthrough, Agent Mitchell's voice carried new excitement. We've secured the coordination center and taken 3 high-value targets into custody, including an individual who matches the profile of a known international terrorist operative. Intelligence materials recovered include operational plans for attacks in cities beyond our original 12 target locations. The discovery confirmed that Operation Thunderstrike had successfully disrupted a terrorist network even larger than their initial assessment had indicated. But it also meant that there might be additional cells operating in cities where they didn't have teams positioned for interdiction. Boston team reporting successful interdiction with 7 subjects in custody, came another positive report. Target appeared to be the harbor tunnel system and maritime shipping facilities. Explosive devices were positioned for maximum structural damage to transportation infrastructure. Agent Rodriguez's voice from Los Angeles carried urgent news. Command, we've successfully interdicted the escaped vehicle before it reached airport perimeter. Subject in custody. Explosive device secured. However, interrogation is revealing information about additional operatives who may still be at large in the LA area. The pattern emerging from multiple cities suggested that while Operation Thunderstrike was succeeding in disrupting the coordinated attacks, the terrorist network included more operatives than their intelligence had initially identified. Each successful interdiction was revealing information about additional threats that required immediate follow-up operations. Detroit team, successful interdiction of target cell, came the report from the Midwest operation. However, subjects had already moved significant quantities of explosive materials to unknown secondary locations. We may be looking at dispersed attack capabilities rather than centralized operations. The intelligence was troubling because it suggested that some terrorist cells had anticipated the possibility of their primary locations being compromised and had implemented backup plans that could allow them to continue with modified attacks even after their main operations were disrupted. Phoenix team, target location secured, but we've discovered evidence of coordination with criminal organizations that weren't identified in the original intelligence, came another complicating report. The terrorist network appears to have developed relationships with domestic criminal groups that provided logistical support and local knowledge. As reports continued flowing in from all 12 cities, Allyson realized that Operation Thunderstrike was revealing the true complexity of what they had been facing. The terrorist network wasn't simply an international organization operating on American soil. It was a sophisticated hybrid operation that combined international terrorist expertise with domestic criminal infrastructure and local support networks. All teams, priority intelligence update, she announced through the National Communications Network. Based on recovered intelligence, we're dealing with a network significantly larger than initial assessments indicated. Prepare for extended operations to identify and neutralize additional cells and support networks. Colonel Garrett's voice came through from Fort Braxton with an update that put the entire operation in perspective. Command, based on the intelligence analysis we're conducting here, it appears that the Fort Braxton operation was designed as the symbolic centerpiece of a coordinated attack that would have killed thousands of people and fundamentally undermined American confidence in domestic security. The weight of what they had prevented was becoming clear. Operation Thunderstrike hadn't just disrupted a terrorist attack. It had prevented what could have been the most devastating assault on American civilian and military infrastructure in the nation's history. General Hawkins, Allyson said, turning to address the senior officer who had been observing the operation. Based on current intelligence, I recommend extending Operation Thunderstrike to include follow-up operations in at least 6 additional cities where we've identified potential terrorist activities. The general nodded slowly. Captain, you have authorization to expand the operation as necessary. After what we've seen today, it's clear that we're dealing with a threat that requires the full resources of the federal government to address completely. As the initial phase of Operation Thunderstrike reached its conclusion, Allyson realized that her role in preventing a national catastrophe was far from over. The success of the coordinated interdictions had revealed a terrorist network of unprecedented scope and sophistication, one that would require weeks or months of follow-up operations to completely neutralize. 72 hours after Operation Thunderstrike concluded, Colonel Marcus Garrett sat alone in his office at Fort Braxton, staring at a classified file that had fundamentally altered his understanding of everything he thought he knew about leadership, experience, and the price of making assumptions. The morning sun streamed through his windows, illuminating documents that painted a picture of operational excellence that bordered on the legendary. The file before him wasn't the sanitized personnel record he'd reviewed during Captain Jones's arrival. This was her actual operational history, declassified at the highest levels of government in recognition of her role in preventing what intelligence analysts were now calling the most sophisticated terrorist plot in American history since September 11th. Operation Nightfall, Syria, 2019. Captain Jones had infiltrated a terrorist cell planning coordinated attacks on American embassies across the Middle East. Operating under deep cover for 8 months, she had identified key operatives, mapped financial networks, and coordinated with international intelligence services to disrupt the organization from within. The operation had prevented attacks that could have killed hundreds of American diplomatic personnel and civilians. Operation Desert Shadow, Afghanistan, 2020. Operation Silent Thunder, Iraq, 2021. Captain Jones had coordinated with Kurdish forces and international coalition partners to prevent a chemical weapons attack on civilian populations in Baghdad. The mission required her to operate in hostile territory for 6 weeks, managing multiple intelligence sources while avoiding detection by both terrorist organizations and hostile government forces. Each page revealed operations that would have been career-defining achievements for seasoned special operations veterans. For someone who was supposedly an inexperienced desk officer, the record read like a compilation of the most successful counterterrorism missions of the past decade. A knock on his door interrupted his review of the classified materials. "Come in," he called, closing the file as Captain Allyson Jones entered his office. She looked remarkably composed for someone who had just coordinated a national-level counterterrorism operation that prevented thousands of casualties, but Garrett was beginning to understand that composure under impossible pressure was exactly what defined her character. "Captain," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat, "I've been reading your actual service record, the classified version." He paused, studying her face for any reaction. "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond anything I can adequately express." Allyson sat down in the chair across from his desk, the same chair where she'd endured his skepticism about her qualifications just weeks earlier. "Sir, you made reasonable assumptions based on the information available to you, That's exactly what any responsible commander should do. Reasonable assumptions, Garrett repeated slowly. Captain, I questioned the qualifications of an officer who had prevented chemical weapons attacks, dismantled international terrorist networks, and saved the lives of hundreds of people across multiple theaters of operation. There's nothing reasonable about that level of ignorance. He opened the classified file again, consulting specific pages that detailed operations most people would never know had occurred. Operation Nightfall alone would qualify you for senior leadership positions in any special operations command in the military. The fact that you conducted that mission while maintaining a cover identity that fooled both terrorist operatives and your own chain of command demonstrates capabilities that I frankly didn't believe existed. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of General Patricia Hawkins, who had flown down from Washington to conduct the official after-action review of Operation Thunderstrike. She entered the office with the confident stride of someone accustomed to dealing with matters of national importance. Colonel Garrett, Captain Jones, she said, taking a seat at the conference table. I wanted to personally thank you both for your roles in what intelligence services are calling the most successful counterterrorism operation in American history. She consulted her tablet before continuing. The final assessment shows that Operation Thunderstrike prevented coordinated attacks that would have killed an estimated 2,400 civilians and caused infrastructure damage exceeding $50 billion. More importantly, it demonstrated that American security services can coordinate effectively against threats of unprecedented complexity. Colonel Garrett looked at Allyson with something approaching awe. General, when Captain Jones first arrived at Fort Braxton, I questioned whether she had the experience necessary to handle a routine counterterrorism assignment. I had no idea I was dealing with someone who had been conducting the most sensitive special operations missions in the American military. Colonel, that reaction is exactly why Captain Jones's cover identity was so effective, General Hawkins replied. Her ability to appear as an inexperienced officer while possessing capabilities that exceed most senior special operations veterans made her invaluable for missions requiring deep infiltration of hostile organizations. She activated a secure tablet and pulled up operational summaries. Over the past 6 years, Captain Jones has been responsible for preventing 17 major terrorist attacks, eliminating 4 international terrorist cells, and developing intelligence that led to the capture or elimination of 37 high-value targets. The numbers were staggering in their implications. Allyson had been operating at a level of effectiveness that most counterterrorism professionals could only aspire to achieve over entire careers, and she had accomplished it while maintaining cover identities that concealed her true capabilities from everyone around her. What makes Captain Jones unique, the general continued, isn't just her operational success but her ability to work effectively with personnel who have no knowledge of her actual background. Most special operations veterans struggle to function in conventional military environments because they're accustomed to working with people who understand their capabilities. Colonel Garrett nodded slowly. I'm beginning to understand that the challenge wasn't Captain Jones proving herself to us. It was her managing our expectations while accomplishing missions that required capabilities we didn't know she possessed. Exactly, Colonel. The Fort Braxton assignment was designed to test whether she could lead conventional military and civilian law enforcement personnel in complex counterterrorism operations without revealing her specialized background. Operation Thunderstrike proved that she can coordinate national-level responses while maintaining the trust and confidence of people who see her as a peer rather than a legendary operative. Allyson had remained silent during the exchange, but now she spoke with the quiet confidence that Garrett was beginning to recognize as characteristic of her approach to leadership. Sir, what matters isn't what I've accomplished in previous assignments, but whether we successfully protected the people we were responsible for protecting. It was a response that perfectly encapsulated what Garrett had learned about her character over the past few weeks. Despite possessing capabilities that would justify considerable ego and self-promotion, she consistently focused on mission accomplishment and the welfare of others rather than personal recognition. Captain, he said, I want you to know that your performance over the past few weeks has fundamentally changed how I think about leadership and experience. You've demonstrated that true expertise isn't about credentials or recognition. It's about the ability to make the right decisions under pressure and inspire others to perform beyond their normal capabilities. General Hawkins consulted her notes. Which brings us to your next assignment, Captain. Based on your performance with Operation Thunderstrike, the Pentagon is creating a new permanent task force for domestic counterterrorism operations. You'll be promoted to major and given command of a multi-agency unit with national jurisdiction and resources. The promotion was well-deserved recognition for someone who had prevented a national catastrophe, but Garrett realized it also meant that Fort Braxton would be losing an officer whose capabilities exceeded anything they were likely to see again. "Congratulations, Captain, or should I say Major Jones," he said, extending his hand. "It's been an honor serving with someone whose dedication to protecting others exemplifies the best traditions of military service." As the meeting concluded and General Hawkins departed for Washington, Garrett found himself alone with Allyson for what would likely be their final conversation as base commander and subordinate officer. "Major Jones," he said, "I want you to know that working with you has been one of the most educational experiences of my career. You've taught me that assumptions about other people's capabilities are often just limitations in our own understanding." "Colonel, the respect has been mutual," she replied. "You created an environment where mission success was more important than personal ego, and that made it possible to accomplish what we did together." As Allyson left his office for the final time, Colonel Garrett returned to the classified file that documented her extraordinary service record. Reading through operations that had prevented terrorist attacks across 3 continents, he realized that the young captain he had initially doubted had been one of the most effective counterterrorism operatives in American military history. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had questioned her experience while looking at someone whose combat record included some of the most successful special operations missions ever conducted. It was a humbling reminder that true expertise often masquerades as quiet competence, and that the most dangerous assumption any leader can make is believing they can judge another person's capabilities based on surface appearances. 6 months later, when Fort Braxton received a commendation for its role in Operation Thunderstrike, Colonel Garrett would include a note about the importance of recognizing excellence regardless of its packaging. It was a lesson taught by a 28-year-old captain whose unassuming demeanor concealed capabilities that had saved thousands of lives and prevented one of the most devastating terrorist attacks in American history. Major Allyson Jones had proven that experience isn't measured by age or conventional credentials, but by the ability to make life-and-death decisions under impossible pressure while inspiring others to achieve more than they believed possible. It was a lesson that would influence how Colonel Garrett evaluated personnel for the rest of his career, and a reminder